Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at George Washington's presidency, and you're going to see with George Washington, being that he is the first president, he is going to set a lot of the precedent for what future presidents would do. He will also be get to be the president that kind of paves the way as far as the early setup of our government, things with the court system, and other things. Now, one of the big things that he does is creating the cabinet. Which would be those formal advisors to the president. And one of the things that he strictly puts in place with the cabinet is that the cabinet would be approved by the Senate, but the only way that they would be able to be removed from office is if Washington himself removed them from office. So the purpose of this was to keep Congress from meddling within the cabinet during that time. So Congress could not remove a cabinet member. Keep that in mind because that's something that's going to come back in 80 years or so. We will talk about issues with that will happen later. Now, with Washington's cabinet, you're going to see a lot of Washington's administration is defined by the battle between two men, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State. Now, these two guys had fundamentally different views on many, many things. The chief thing that they had disagreements on was how to interpret the Constitution and how that applied to having a national bank. Alexander Hamilton felt that a national bank was very, very important for the future of the country to help us get established as far as trading with other countries, provide stability for our economy. One of the key parts of Alexander Hamilton's plan was to take on the debt from the states. A lot about this plan worried Jefferson because he worried that if the states were indebted to the national government, that would give them more power. Alexander Hamilton would look at it and say, well, exactly, we want the federal government to have more power. And Jefferson believed in more state power, whereas Hamilton believed in a very strong national government. They also disagreed on how to interpret the Constitution. Jefferson was a strict constructionist, and he said, hey, if it doesn't say it in the Constitution explicitly, then we should not be able to do that thing. Hamilton looked at the Constitution and had what we refer to as a loose interpretation of the Constitution. He believed that we could look at the Constitution, and he said, basically, you read into the document and what it says. So he said, famously, he would use the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, which says the government can make any laws necessary and proper. And he'd say, hey, a national bank is necessary, so we should create that. The other area where you're going to see big disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson is on foreign relations. Jefferson, during his time in France, really fell in love with France, the French people, and just France in general as a country. So he was more pro-French in his foreign policy. You're going to see that Alexander Hamilton is more pro-British with his foreign policy. And I think a lot of that goes back to the trade that we could have with the British as a result. At this time, you're going to have the French Revolution flare up over there in Europe. And Jefferson, again, very much sided with the French people and felt like that we should support France in the French Revolution. Hamilton, on the other side of that, was not a fan of that idea at all. In fact, he was in many ways preparing almost to go to war with France because of the French Revolution and because of fears over what that would mean here in the New World, with the French having still a large amount of territory here, what would eventually become the Louisiana Purchase. So, yeah, when we talk about Washington's presidency, again, a lot of it focuses on that battle between Jefferson and Hamilton. You'll see that I have put in the slides today a lot of links, some links to some songs from Hamilton, the musical. I'm sure that some of you have probably seen that by this point, but it does have some songs in it that do really good at explaining the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson. Now, eventually, Jefferson would resign from the cabinet because of the issues that him and Alexander Hamilton had, and because of Jefferson feeling like that Hamilton was constantly, or that Washington was constantly siding with Hamilton, which a lot of times Washington did side with Hamilton. They had previously been friends during the American Revolution when Alexander Hamilton had served under George Washington. The next big thing in Washington's presidency that happens that really represents a challenge to the federal government and shows how the government under the U.S. Constitution now has a lot more power than the Articles of Confederation. You would have what was known as the Whiskey Rebellion happen in Pennsylvania because of a large excise tax that had been put in place on whiskey. You're going to see some of the whiskey distillers there get very upset. They decide to rebel. And for the first and only time thus far in American history, you were going to have George Washington as president ride up with the military to put down the rebellion. Luckily, it did not lead to a war between the two sides. But really, you're going to see now that under this new U.S. Constitution, whereas under Shays' Rebellion, the government had no power to do anything with Shays' Rebellion. In the Whiskey Rebellion, you have the President of the United States actually marching in to Pennsylvania to help put down this rebellion. I know I always talk about it in class. It's kind of weird to think about, a sitting U.S. president riding into battle. It's like imagining Donald Trump in the Middle East riding, into battle in a tank over there. Kind of seems funny in our head to think about that. But George Washington, he did ride into battle. So again, to sum it up, really this is going to focus on Jefferson versus Hamilton in the battle between those two. And of course, you're going to see at the end of Washington's presidency, him after 2 terms deciding to retire and turn over the reins to somebody else, which is very, very important because, again, like I started out the video saying, a lot of people believe that Washington could have been king if he had wanted to. That's how much reverence and respect that people had for George Washington. Of course, he chose not to do that. And that would work for 31 presidents who would decide not to try to run for more than 2 terms. So good luck jumping into Washington's presidency. I really do hope that you enjoy the Hamilton songs that I've included as part of that because they're pretty catchy. And if you ever have a chance, make sure you see the whole Hamilton musical because it does a pretty good job of explaining the life of Alexander Hamilton. And don't think that this is the last you're going to hear about Alexander Hamilton because in the next video, we're going to be talking about him in reference to John Adams' administration and the big influence that he would have there. So again, as always, if you need any help, please let me know. Otherwise, have a fantastic day.